Hi, I'm Eloy Ortiz Oakley, and welcome back to The Rant, the podcast where we pull back the curtain and break down the people, the policies, and the politics of our higher education system. In this episode, I get to talk to two very special guests who have been following the recent Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action very closely. My guests today are Teresa Watanabe, staff writer at the Los Angeles Times, and who has been covering the University of California Board of Regents for several years. Also joining me is Jess Bravin, Supreme Court correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, and more importantly, at least for me, a former California Community College student and a former UC student regent. Teresa and Jess, welcome to The Rant.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Eloy.
Yep, terrific to join you.
Well, it's good to see you both, and I know that you've both had a busy couple of weeks at the beginning of this month. A lot going on with the Supreme Court, and a lot going on that sort of brings back memories of 1996 here in California. We'll get into that a little bit more, but before we jump into all of that, let me start with a personal question for each of you so that our listeners get to know you a little bit better. I've had the pleasure of getting to know you both, and I think you have wonderful stories, wonderful backgrounds. So tell us about your higher education journey and what led you to your interest in journalism. Teresa, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me, Eloy. I'm actually a Seattle native, born and raised there. And so I started off at the University of Washington. But after I finished my sophomore year, I just decided to go study at a university in Tokyo, Japan for a year. And I was really at that time wanting to become a lawyer, but I didn't want to major in political science or something that wouldn't pay the bills if I somehow did not pass the bar exam. And so some of the students I met in Japan were from USC, sorry, UC, but they told me that they had a really good journalism program and I thought that'd be a good pre-law major. So I transferred to USC and I took my first Journalism 101 class, and it was love at first sight. I just said, forget law. This is amazing. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I ended up graduating from USC with a double major in journalism and East Asian languages and culture. Got my first job out of USC with the LA Herald Examiner and wrote editorials there as a kid out of college, like trying to opine on the world, knowing really nothing, and then worked for the San Jose Mercury News in various assignments, and then joined the LA Times, where I've covered various beats, most recently higher education.
Wow. Hearing the word Herald Examiner brings back a lot of memories for myself. Jess, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your story.
Thanks. Sure. Oh, well, I was born in New York City. Both my parents were immigrants and attended at one point or other the City College of New York. We moved to California when I was 10, where I attended public school. And I really, had a chance to experience different aspects of higher education in this country. As you said, I took classes at West LA College and Santa Monica College. I went to Harvard College as an undergraduate. I went to UC Berkeley for law school. So I had various institutions, but I had experience in the intestines of several of them. I was always interested in education policy and what education can do. When I was in high school, I was the first student member of the Los Angeles City Board of Education.
Wow.
And years later, I did that same type of job when I was on the UC Regents. And I was there well, all times are consequential at the Board of Regents. So I don't know that my time was any more than any others, but the mix of issues that we had was, I think, very interesting and very important. And as you say, continue to echo to this day. Right now, though I'm not in the policy business, I'm a journalist, so I really don't take positions on these issues now.
Jess, let me ask you, while you were a student at UC Berkeley School of Law, you became the student member of the University of California Board of Regents. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience, and in particular, the conversations that the Regents were having about affirmative action and race-conscious admissions at that time?
The affirmative action question was brewing before I was on the board, and it was particularly driven by one of the regents at the time, Ward Connerly. a very interesting character. And actually, before he brought up his proposal to end race-conscious admissions, he was very popular with students because he was one of the few regents who took fee increases very seriously and opposed almost all of them. He was one of the few regents who took very seriously free speech issues and giving opportunities for the public to speak to the regents and get involved in regional policy. So he was actually somebody who was relatively popular, if any regent is popular, with the students who write checks to something called UC Regents. Once he decided that abolishing affirmative action was his number one objective and quickly attained allegiance from Governor P. Wilson, who had appointed Ward Connerly to the board, things changed, and this became his most important issue. It was something that became extraordinarily divisive on the board. When I was on the board, nearly all the political appointees were chosen by Republican governors. In fact, I think all of them were. And yet they were divided on affirmative action themselves. The board was, I think, it was like a 14-10 vote or something like that. It was a relatively close vote on the board where most issues are decided unanimously. So it divided the Republicans on the board of regents. The student member at the time, Ed Gomez from UC Riverside, alumni regents were certainly opposed to ending affirmative action. So was the president of the university, Dick Atkinson, and the university administration and faculty as well. And it really was something that was being imposed, or the end, or this interference in the admissions process was being imposed by the regents on the university. And it was a very difficult experience for the university where academic freedom had been really taken for granted for many, many years. And at the meeting in 1995, when the board passed SP1 and SP2, the two motions that Regent Connerly brought up, they were incredibly raucous events. There were protests. The board room was evacuated several times by the UC police. There were protests outside the building that were massive. It was a huge, wrenching experience for the University of California system. Ward Connerly continued beyond just ending racially conscious admissions. He also wanted to end any kind of statistical research into the backgrounds of students. He wanted to eliminate whether you counted, Black, Hispanic, what have you, different racial or ethnic characteristics. And that, I believe, didn't pass later on. But that occurred during my tenure. He had a very, I would say, I don't want to be pejorative, but he had a very extreme view of colorblindness that he thought the university should pursue. And it was the dominant social issue affecting the university during my term.
Yeah, I imagine that had quite an impact on you as a member of the University of California Student Association, and then as a student regent. I imagine when SCOTUS recently acted on race-conscious admissions, some of those members came back to you.
They never left, and I certainly recall that whole episode. And of course, as you know, and as he suggested, Connerly went on past our board after it passed the UC Regents. He then promoted this voter initiative, Prop 209, which passed in 1996 and really sort of superseded whatever the regents were doing. And the regents rescinded Connerly's motions in 2000 or 2001, but that was really a symbolic move because the voter initiative was still in the state constitution. And voters reaffirmed it, as you said, in 2020 by even greater margins than they approved 209 in the first place.
That moment in time, I was in Los Angeles, and it was certainly an event that stuck in my mind. And when I had the privilege of being appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to the Board of Regents, that is the first memory that I had walking into a meeting of the Board of Regents was Ward Connerly. And that stuck with me my entire time on the Board of Regents. Teresa, let me turn to you. You've been covering the Regents for some time now. What kind of conversations have you witnessed about affirmative action with regards to California's Proposition 209, which is, Jeff mentioned, banned race-conscious admissions in California in 1996? And what do you think has been the impact of Prop 209 on diversity at the University of California?
Well, one thing that I did want to add to what Jess was talking about was the enormous influence that Governor Pete Wilson had on this whole issue. He was in the middle of a presidential campaign. He was not gaining traction. And he decided that affirmative action would be one of the major issues that he was going to run on, which is why, in some ways, he was, I don't want to say the power behind the throne, but he was really pushing Ward Connerly to do this, both at the UC Regents and later on with Proposition 209. And as Jess also pointed out, the majority, if not all of the members of the Board of Regents at the time were Republican. Now, fast forward to 2020, when Proposition 16 was in play, which would have reversed 209, and the political climate had changed almost 180 degrees. You now have Democrats in control of the governor's mansion, in control, a supermajority in the legislature, definitely supermajority of the Board of Regents. And so the political sensibilities are completely different, where there is such a focus on access and equity and inclusion. And I think all of that led to the support of the Board of Regents for Proposition 16, which was introduced in order to reverse 209, because, as you know, there is a feeling that for all the work that UC has done over 25 years to try and diversify its students and faculty without the use of race, and there has been a lot of progress, but they just feel that without being able to consider race, it's not going to be completely effective. And so I think at that time, the UC president, all 10 chancellors, the Board of Regents all supported Prop 16. But as just noted, it failed again. And interestingly, it was opposed by white voters, and Latino and Asian voters split, and it was overwhelmingly supported only among Black voters in terms of demographics. So, I just think that UC has done really great work. And, I often think, Eloy, that UC doesn't give itself enough credit for all the work it's done. Because, if you look at the data, and I've looked at the data so much and I've written about the data, there is progress. There are more students of color and higher percentages of students of color being admitted to the University of California today than in 1995 before Prop 209 passed. And granted, it does not yet reflect the percentages in our California population, especially with Latinos, but they've come a long way. They've spent over $500 million trying to diversify the population, the enrollment, and they've done so many different programs, much of which you were part of. They moved to comprehensive review, which helped diversify. They moved to eligibility in the local context, which means that any student who qualifies in the top 9% statewide or at your local high school is guaranteed admission. They've done so much outreach, recruiting. They've worked on, getting those K-12 pipelines ready for students in high school or even younger, middle school, to try to become competitive college applicants. So I think there's a lot to be learned from UC, especially for institutions who are now facing college admissions without being able to use race. And, there is much that UC has done.
I certainly agree with you, Teresa. I mean, there has been quite a bit done, and I think it is an interesting lesson for the rest of the country. I think in the immediate years after Prop 209, we saw a measurable decline in Black enrollment in the University of California. So I think that is a word of warning to the rest of the country. I think it's had the greatest impact on the Black community. I think 1994, UC was about 4% African American. 2000 dropped to 3%. It bounced back in 2022 to 4.5%. That's been the most stubborn area of enrollment. And I do think that the university has done quite a bit. And so I'm hopeful that the rest of the country can take some lessons from that. And also the lessons of of the deja vu all over again we have going on here with Republican candidates using this as an issue to run for president. We'll see if it has the same effect on the Republican Party that it had on California.
One thing I wanted to add, Eloy, was if you look at who the University of California admits, I mean, UC admits nearly enough Black and Latino applicants to fill the entire freshman class of Berkeley and UCLA. So the real challenge is getting those students who are admitted to choose UC. And that is the real struggle. And I think a lot of that has to do with maybe cost. You know, they maybe have unmet financial need. And California is a leader in offering financial aid. But I know UCLA, which has been incredibly successful in their yield of Black students, part of it is just the work that Yolanda Copeland Morgan has done with her team to get out in the community. But a lot of it is the fact that they've been able to raise more money for scholarships. And I think that is the area that UC is going to have to do more work on, is trying to increase those yields of the applicants that they admit.
No, that's right. And it's a great point. Jess, let me turn to you. You've had a ringside seat for this Supreme Court. What do you feel were the primary motivating factors for this ruling? And you may have seen the recent legal action taken against Harvard University over legacy admissions, because that comes up quite a bit. How do you think this would play out if this reaches this court?
Well, I don't think the question has to do really with protected classes of people. The default rule in American law is that anyone can discriminate against anyone except where they specifically can't. And discriminate obviously is, sounds bad and it is bad, but really maybe we should use the word choose. Okay. They can have different priorities about who they want to admit. It is, you could say that Harvard College discriminates, in favor of saxophone players, because if you are a fantastic musician, your odds of getting admitted to Harvard College are much higher than if you are similar in your credentials, but do not have that kind of skill. And if you are an exceptional hockey player, your odds of getting admission to Harvard College are, I would say, 1,000,000%, at least based on my freshman dorm experience and the gentlemen scholars who occupied my floor. So I do not believe that there is a tradition of discrimination for or against, legacy admits, people whose parents went to the same college. There's just no legal structure involved in that. So Harvard and any college, I don't believe, has any legal restraint right now on giving a priority to if your parents also went there. There's not it doesn't fit into any of the specific boxes. I mean, the law is concerned about equal treatment based on race. And race is a third rail for the Supreme Court. It's a third rail for many, many Americans, although it functions in different ways. For the majority on the Supreme Court, it's any government effort to advantage a race, even one that historically has suffered tremendous discrimination and setbacks. That's just a terrible concept in and of itself. And whatever benign or beneficial outcomes might be are outweighed by the conceptual harm to democracy of any kind of racial privilege. That's their view. All right. And, it's not an indefensible view by any means. It is their view. In fact, it's interesting. I was speaking to just recently retired president of Columbia University, Lee Bollinger, who was the defendant in the prior precedents that were overruled last month, Grutter and Gratz versus Bollinger. And I asked him what he made of the other arguments. And he said, if that's a view, that the dangers of any kind of racial classification are so great and the risks are so high of going in the wrong direction that we simply, as a matter of principle, can't have it, he felt that was a defensible argument. What he did not feel was a defensible argument was there's no racial discrimination and there are no impacts from the history of racial discrimination. And therefore, there's nothing to be solved. Okay? In other words, that was his view. That he felt was not a legitimate argument. The U.S. Supreme Court and the writings of Chief Justice Roberts and the history of other justices like Justice Alito from his days in the Concerned Alumni of Princeton organization, which was formed after Princeton University began admitting women, recruiting minority students. Their views go back many, many years, and there's no dispute that they're sincerely held and that this is where they were going and this is how they viewed the requirements of the Constitution. When it comes to admitting legacies, people whose parents also went to those colleges, I think they don't think it's a legal matter. I think they would not be for it or against it. One point that Chris Eidsgruber, who's the president of Princeton University, and I talked about was that highly selective institutions now have had forms of affirmative action going back a couple generations already. And those programs have admitted a significant number of Black and Latino, Asian, other members of other groups that historically were excluded. And they have children too. And they benefit from those legacy admissions. So if you abolish legacy admissions, sure, most of the beneficiaries of it are white, but not all. Right. And that would also it would in some way undermine the built-in progress, I guess, or the grandfathered in progress that they made during the decades of affirmative action when they did admit or were permitted to consider race in admission. So now the complaint, going to Harvard, really, it's going to be a policy question for Harvard and these other schools about what they're going to do. Probably they would win any legal challenge. I think they have to decide in their commitment to diversity where fostering donations or loyalty or whatever sense of community they believe legacy admissions helps is worth it or not. And it will, in a sense, force them to make a harder choice because, the Harvard alumni are much in favor of affirmative action. That's quite clear. They've elected members to their board of overseers who are in favor of it. But what if it means some, marginal, unquantifiable reduction in the chance that their own kids are going to get in? How much do you care about diversity then? Okay. If the diversity involves excluding you, what about that? We'll see if they announce any changes on their own.
Well, it's interesting to see Larry Summers out recently talking about his call to end legacy admissions. Of course, Larry's a former president of Harvard himself. So we'll see where that all goes. But I certainly do think that given all the commotion about the SCOTUS decision, there is so much institutions of learning can do themselves to improve the outcomes of people of color and low-income people who are trying to get access to these highly, what we call rejective colleges and universities. So I'm hopeful that this conversation does spur a lot of thinking, not just on the legal issues, but on the practices that many, many colleges and universities.
Eloy, can I raise a point that from what I could tell, this is what I thought about a little bit when I came onto the board and was looking at this issue. And it was an analysis that absolutely no one else agreed with. So, and I don't even know if I agree with it. And you and Teresa have more recent data and you can update it with facts. But during the two polls of the affirmative action debate during my time around there went these ways. These, minority applicants, Black, Hispanic applicants who are the principal beneficiaries of affirmative action, they are all UC qualified. So there's not a damage, to the academic quality of the institution. And simultaneously, the argument was, everyone who was admitted to affirmative action was also UC qualified, right? Principal document when I was on board was a master plan for higher education of 1960 under Governor Pat Brown's administration. And it set forth that the top 12.5% of the UC or the California high school class was entitled to admission to the University of California. The only people who benefit from affirmative action at UC were already in that group. They're already in the top 8th of the high school graduating class. Where is it that affirmative action played a role? It played a role at admission only to UCLA and UC Berkeley. The other campuses, all those people would all be entitled to a seat in one of the other campuses already. They, on one hand, believed and we asserted that all our UC campuses are all equal. They're all good. They're all equal. They all provide a absolutely world-class education that no one could possibly fault. And at the same time, two of these campuses are a million times better than all the other ones. And if you end up sent to one of the other ones, boy, man, you're doomed, right? So, well, which is it? It's not like you still are getting one of the most fantastic educations available to anyone in the world at a great price. And guess what? If you're one of the white students or Asian students who is redirected to Santa Cruz or Riverside instead of Berkeley or UCLA, you also have a fantastic education being provided to you at tremendous subsidy. So the consequences, whether it is the white legacy student from Cal, or the immigrant student from Mexico who has to go to Davis instead of Berkeley, I just don't think that person is educationally disadvantaged either way. And if the point of the state of California's interest in providing these people education, mission accomplished. To me, the problem was, and you point out that UC has taken many more steps in this direction, were the many, many people who were not qualified in the first place to even be in the mix to go to one of these schools. And that's the problem. This may be heretical. I even felt, you go to community college or Cal State, maybe your life isn't over either. Maybe you also have an opportunity for a really, really good education and doing something with your life and being a fulfilled person. So I thought, the symbolic message that we were sending about educational opportunity was at least as important as the consequences for any student who has the tremendous horror of going to UC Santa Barbara instead of UCLA, whether that is a white student or Hispanic or Black student.
Similar conversations keep happening now, and I'd love to get Teresa's take as well. But for me, the question of who gets into Berkeley, who gets into UCLA is still in play. Their diversity is not quite as rich as perhaps Merced or Riverside. But the fact of the matter is UC San Diego is in that mix as well. It's become quite difficult. UCI is getting quite difficult, although it's a Hispanic serving institution. But for me, there is one University of California, and regardless of which campus you go to, you get an amazing education. But we've put a premium over time on two particular campuses, and today probably three, the big three, what we call them. But there is still a challenge, particularly for Black Californians. Having access to the University of California is still a challenge, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. For Latino students, it's getting there, but there's still a challenge of affordability that Teresa mentioned. So there's still a lot of work to do. Teresa, I love your take on Jess's point.
Well, I think the admission counselors that I interview all the time really talk about fit. Don't be blinded by the brand name. Really look at the campus and find out, is that the campus that fits you the best? Berkeley is not for everybody. If you want to major in data science or computer science, Berkeley is like the top school in the nation. And they also make a lot of money when they graduate. But if you want to study environmental science, I know people who've done really well at UC Santa Barbara because they've at UC San Diego as well. Merced has some of the happiest students in the whole UC system because it's smaller, it's more intimate. The professors actually get to know the students. They have amazing experiences with undergraduate research. And there's a lot of students of color. And so in many cases, students of color who may be leaving their home for the first time ever feel a little more secure at a place like Merced. So I think, as Eloy said, all of the campuses are amazing. They all offer something slightly different. And I really think that students or applicants need to look and see what it is they want to do and then match that interest and fit with the UC campus.
Right. One thing that they could be doing at the Regents, the Organic Act of the University of California says that the Regents are directed to, as soon as practicable, establish tuition-free education for qualified residents. How's that going?
More than half of UC students don't even pay tuition because of the incredibly generous Cal Grant program. I don't know that making UC free for students who have the ability to pay is necessarily the right answer. I think it's really beefing up the financial aid for students who can't afford to go to UC.
When I was on the board, I had a completely different idea, Teresa. My view was this: means-tested programs like that are incredibly damaging to creating popular support. In other words, voters do not like the idea of, hey, I have a great program. I'll give money that will help somebody else. How about that? That's a great program. The government will take money from me and give it to somebody else. I'm all for that. programs like Social Security or Medicare that provide universal benefits are popular because people believe there's something in it for them. Even if there may be more in it for somebody else. But if it's just taking money from one person and allowing the financial aid bureaucracy to set up criteria about who gets the money, that was incredibly damaging to popular support for UC and incredibly damaging for voter support for UC. It's the private education model. Okay. It's the Harvard model. We will have extraordinarily high retail costs for applying, and then we will kick it back to people who meet our criteria for financial aid. Princeton and Harvard now give free education to certain people who below certain income thresholds. That's the private education model. The public education model at CCNY, at UC, until really the Reagan and first Jerry Brown 1.0 administrations, and then it really accelerated under Duke Majan and Wilson, was to go to the private model, which is we'll have very high tuition and we'll, reallocate, redistribute funds to people who we want to see get in. And that is, means-tested programs are not popular politically. That's not what they want to see.
I don't know that the voters necessarily object to California's financial aid program. And certainly the legislators right now, their whole big thing is affordability, and they are funding higher education at pretty high levels. And also the UC tuition is only about $13,000 a year compared to USC, which is $66,000 a year. So, the private education model doesn't really compare to a Harvard or a Princeton when you look at the size of their tuition. What do you think, Eloy?
Well, this is the topic for a whole episode in and of itself. I've been in those conversations, mostly arguments for years and years and years. I think the University of California certainly has a much richer model than most publics and certainly all of the privates. However, the challenge has been the divestment in public higher education from states, including California. And that has put a lot of pressure on universities, public universities. Some have responded well, some not so well. And there were periods of time that the University of California did not respond so well by trying to pass on the cost to the student and then asking the federal government to federalize the cost of education through the Pell system. That's been a challenge in recent years because the cost of attendance has gone up so high in states like California. It's been hard. Now, this California legislature, the last two governors have invested quite a bit more in the University of California. So I do think that there is a balance that has to be had. The majority of students now are either low income or middle income at the University of California. It's tough to fund their education without the support of the state, but it's going to be increasingly more difficult to raise tuition at the University of California. This last round of tuition increase came after several years of fights and finally settled on a cohort tuition model. We'll see how the California State University system does here coming up. But tuition and financial aid are challenging topics in states like California. But let me ask both of you as we begin to wrap up, if you had any advice based on your experiences in your roles in California for other states on how to deal with this recent SCOTUS ruling around race-conscious admissions, what would that be? Teresa, let's start with you.
I talk to admission directors all the time. And one thing that really stuck out for me was when Yolanda Copeland Morgan, who recently stepped down as vice provost of enrollment management at UCLA, her big takeaway, which was also mentioned by Sean Harper of USC, is do not overreact. Right. They said after Proposition 209, all the legal counsel said, oh my God, we can't use race. And so they were really just cut those numbers. And she said, don't do that. Take time to look through it. There's still a lot you can do, maybe not consider race, but there's so many different ways that you can add diversity, whether it's socioeconomic diversity and other things like that. So that was her big takeaway in terms of advice.
Jess, how about you?
I think that, like Teresa, I'm not going to give advice, but the things that I've heard, I think that the focus really should be on these pipelines that universities, if they want to maintain or increase diversity, they need to increase the number and the breadth of students who are qualified on their own terms to be admitted to selective colleges and programs. And that may require universities to focus much more directly on working with K-12 education, on working with community colleges to establish ways to bring in people with varied backgrounds. When I was speaking to President Eisgruber of Princeton, he mentioned two things. I know they've been written about before, but Princeton has a pilot program of working with community colleges to bring transfers to its campus. And he also mentioned that they were going to increase their recruitment of military veterans, which is a more diverse group of people than the public at large. And if they were to increase veteran recruitment, and veteran privileges incidentally are permissible, in fact, I believe the government encourages them, that too would promote diversity in enrollment. So I think that they're going to have to find, more creative, perhaps more costly ways to ensure that they have a wide variety of applicants who aren't qualified for admission.
On that note, I certainly want to echo the importance of community college transfers. I think that's how I got into the University of California. And as I said before, there is diversity at your local community college because they serve the top 100% of their community. So I do think that that's a great advice. And I thank you both for joining me here on the RAD. This is a meaty topic, lots to talk about, and perhaps we'll circle back one of these days and talk a little bit more. So Jess and Teresa, thanks for joining me here on the RAD.
Thank you.
A lot of fun. Thanks.
All right. Well, this was a great conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Really appreciate having Teresa Watanabe and Jess Bravin here on the rant. Thanks for joining us, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button. And if you're following us on the YouTube channel, hit subscribe. Please leave me your comments, your thoughts on this interview. Let me know your thoughts on race-conscious admissions. And continue to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for joining us here on The Rant, and take care, everybody.